So this series is supported by the Climate Adaptation Research Center to showcase the latest research done on the UC Davis campus. Today's webinar is about benchmarking progress towards social equity focused climate adaptation planning and is presented by Dr. Eric Chu. Dr. Chu is an assistant professor of community and regional development, as well as a co-director of the Climate Adaptation Research Center. He studies how local governments and communities plan for and adapt to the impacts of global environmental change. His research is globally comparative and draws on qualitative and participatory methodologies. Dr. Chu's recent research projects have looked into how emerging climate change adaptation priorities are being institutionalized into local decision-making, how climate adaptation intersects with economic development, human health, environmental sustainability, and infrastructure planning priorities, as well as how communities mobilize for more equitable climate adaptation and resilience solutions. He's currently serving as lead author in Working Group 2 of the 6th Assessment Report to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Dr. Chu, take it away.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Sandra. I'm seeing a lot of familiar names on the chat, so that's fantastic. And one of the things that I want to do today is really just to start a conversation around some of these really important points about equity and justice in planning for and implementing climate adaptation resilience work. My work is around the world, but I'll try to focus a little bit on the US today, while knowing that there are a couple international participants here, and so we'll try to do that. As I mentioned, I'm Eric Chu. I'm in the Community and Regional Development group here at UC Davis. My work, Sandra has already described, but welcome everybody. Today is Indigenous Peoples Day, and so I guess I do want to quickly do a quick land acknowledgement here, since I'm at UC Davis campus, and that just is appropriate to acknowledge that the land on which UC Davis sits, for thousands of years, this land has been home to the Patwin people. And today there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: the Quechua-Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzal-Dihi Wintun Nation, and the Yocha-Dihi Wintun Nation. So we acknowledge the land that we're currently at, and wherever you are, as well. All right, so let's get going. I guess the point of today is really to, as I mentioned, to catalyze a conversation around how do we actually do equitable adaptation on the ground. And a lot of you have experience here already. And so I'm going to ask Sandra to monitor the chat as we go along, because there are opportunities to learn from each other. And I don't profess to know everything about equity and justice in terms of climate adaptation. I study those who are trying to do this on the ground. And so many of you have a lot of experience. So I urge you to contribute to the conversation on the chat. And so hopefully Sandra will be able to monitor that and bring up anything that's important. The second half of my presentation will be much more about the specifics of benchmarking, talking about an ongoing project that we have here at UC Davis, trying to assess and analyze what exactly are cities and local governments and some regional governments doing to make sure that they're actually fulfilling the commitments that they're articulating in the plans and policies that are out there, and doing this in a comparative way. But the first half of today's presentation, hopefully the next 15 or so minutes, is much more general in case some of you are just interested in thinking about social equity focused adaptation planning and implementation at the local level. Just give you a sense of what's out there, how it's talked about. And then the second half will dive into more specifics of things. So hopefully that'll take us maybe about 30, hopefully no more than 40 minutes. But knowing myself, I tend to go off on tangents. And so I have my phone in front of me to time myself. So hopefully I'll manage to rein myself in. There. All right, and so why adaptation? This is our first introductory slide. And I'm an urban planner by training. And so I have a particular interest in studying local jurisdictions, large and small cities. And most of my work has been around the world. And because I spent the first half of my academic career teaching and researching outside, I've only just recently returned to this country, well, pre-pandemic, right before the pandemic. And so the timelines since then have been totally muddled in my head. So cities, I'm interested in studying cities. Historically has been focused on mitigation type issues, greenhouse gases, et cetera, that we're all familiar with. But for the past 10, 15 years or so, cities and local jurisdictions have been realizing that, in fact, the climate change is happening and there are many shocks and stressors that are happening within their jurisdiction. And so adapting to different kinds of climate impacts, such as sea level rise, heat, extreme precipitation, cold spells, et cetera, are actually quite needed. And in fact, many of these priorities lie within their mandates of strengthening built environment infrastructure against shocks and stressors, about planning for public health, access to different kinds of services, et cetera. And what's really key when we're thinking about equity and justice is that climate impacts disproportionately impact those communities that are historically disadvantaged, because oftentimes they're located in areas that are high exposure, they have lower access to services and infrastructure to improve their capacity to adapt to change. And they have generally, I mean, these are just general statements, lower ability to pool together or to steer resources and services to support their adaptation to different kinds of shocks and stressors. So integrating climate adaptation ideas is actually quite key to supporting different kinds of development on the local level. And adaptation actually has a very distinct logic, which we'll come to in the next slide. And so feel free to, those who actually work on adaptation, you can, I'm sure, talk a lot more about that logic. And so I'll give just a brief overview. And cities and local communities, on the final point here, are increasingly seen as nodes or laboratories of climate adaptation and resilience action. And Sandra mentioned my work with the IPCC, and increasingly there's a focus on local scale actions and how those can inform actually more global directions on adaptation, which is an interesting development. So the logic of adaptation here, I've just pulled this figure from equitably, a large transnational municipal network looking at sustainability in particular, but this is a slide that I pulled from a class that I taught earlier this year in planning climate resilient communities undergrad class, and we talked about the different steps and tools, and so this should be familiar for many of you. The first half of my academic career was really looking at the logic of climate adaptation. So starting in the early 2010s onwards, really diving in and thinking about the different planning tools and strategies that cities utilize to plan for climate adaptation. And some of the key things that emerged were things like leadership, which we're all familiar with. And given the complexities and uncertainties of planning for the future, especially future environmental scenarios that are uncertain, especially we're talking 50, 100 years down the line, there's a strong tendency for experimenting and incremental change. And so thinking about how climate change affects what's happening in our jurisdiction, locally on the ground, and then refining those scenarios as we go along through different tools and strategies that are available. And for the first generation or so of adaptation plans, they were mainly institutional. And so how do we build decision-making arenas? How do we think about policies and regulations? How do we bring together different coalitions from across the city or municipal local government? How do we create new institutions to both deal with the complexities and uncertainties, but also enable the kinds of experimentation that we talked about earlier? And so just a quick example for those of you who are wanting to learn a little bit about this. So this is just thinking about the logic a little bit. We started off in the logic in the previous slide, trying to understand the climate scenarios. And this is just some maps from New York City that I just pulled off from the internet, from their New York City's climate action planning. They have many, but this is just two maps just to show sea level rise and heat. And so one of the first steps of planning for climate adaptation is really understanding the local scenario. And then the institution building this is what I talked about 2 slides ago. And this is the example that New York City has of trying to connect the science through the Panel on Climate Change in New York City, and then the city's own Municipal Climate Adaptation Task Force, and then using science-informed policymaking, informing those in charge, mayor downwards, but also partnering with different academic institutions, industry, and also community groups that are working in this area. And so you see a whole constellation, this new arena of actors that are participating in trying to understand what climate change means for the city. And in the case of New York City, it's really focusing on 5 or 6 key sectors that you see listed down here. And so as we're moving along the decision chain here are some documents that have been produced fairly recently, some of them last year, specifically dealing with urban heat, for example, and also coastal waterfront revitalization, given the climate change scenarios on heat and precipitation that we saw 2 slides ago. So really looking through that decision chain, going from the science and data availability to the policy and regulatory design to actually the planning and implementation stage of the process. And so you can sort of see the logic of how the science actually translates into physical documents. And here, just finishing the chain of actually the implementation parts of this. And so this is just some figures that I pulled off from the waterfront revitalization materials that New York City has. And this is just illustration, artist illustration of Lower Manhattan and some of the coastal infrastructure, green infrastructure that they want to put in. There's some critiques of this process. Many of you are maybe familiar with, and we'll circle back to that for sure. The other example that I want to show, and I'm sure since this is where UC Davis based, probably covering things that folks already are very familiar with, but I just want to sort of repeat the chain of decision, the chain of events in the California context, for example. In California, again, we have a lot of information and data out there showcasing many different aspects of exposure to climate impacts and change. And so wealth of data and knowledge and scientific modeling that's out there. And this is just one example. And I think I saw representatives from OPR. And so definitely jump in if I'm misrepresenting anything here, because they are, at least in California, sort of the home of much of this information. And then here's the chain. You use all the science and information out there on the modeling and the scenario building and the impacts and the exposure and vulnerabilities of communities and economies here in California, for example. And you utilize all that information and you create the kinds of planning institutions and mechanisms that you see here. And OPR has a really good online portal as well, just to give you a sense of, in case you want to zero in on the local communities and counties here in California, to get a sense of what they're doing that's out there already. And OPR has done a very good job of just cataloging all of this and making sure that everybody is out there actually doing the kinds of adaptation planning that's necessary. And I see Nikki here giving me a wink, just a plug for OPR here. Okay, and then here's the third example, just to set the stage of the equity and justice. This is Miami. Like other jurisdictions across the country, Miami, very like New York City and San Francisco Bay Area, et cetera, very vulnerable to sea level rise. And this is, I'm just jumping a couple steps here. This is Miami's artist rendering of a neighborhood redevelopment. That's part of the conversation that's going on around how do you protect waterfront properties against sea level rise. And there's a lot of critique, just harkening back to the Lower Manhattan example, around the kinds of redevelopments and rebuilding that's going on. And the story, just to put it shortly, is that Miami, on sea level, below sea level, and as sea level rise and storm surges become more serious, a lot of the property owners on coastal Miami are looking to move inland into relatively higher ground because of flood insurance issues, because of rebuilding issues, and moving into more inland communities that were historically immigrant neighborhoods, communities historically disadvantaged communities. And so leading to a lot of conversation around gentrification of different neighborhoods, in this particular Little Haiti in Miami. And so just to give you a sense of sort of, okay, so we have a structured way of thinking about adaptation planning, from the science from the institutions to the regulations to actually producing the plans. But then at the tail end of this, when you're actually implementing some of these actions, it actually brings up a lot of really interesting issues around sort of who's benefiting from the interventions that are being put in place. And so just to sum up this sort of foundational introductory set of slides is just a couple of takeaway points here. We have a decade and a half, almost 2 decades of experience on urban adaptation resilience building. And now at this point, for the past couple of years, we're actually coming across a lot more examples of implementation. So for the first 8 or 10 years or so, it was really just at the institutional side of things. And so you could sort of document how things were changing from a paper trail standpoint. But now we're actually seeing a lot more designs, engineered designs, some big, some small, implementation, new infrastructure, new community groups being put in place, new sources of money that's being devoted, especially in the case of California as well. New sources of social mobilization to contest some of the who benefits questions that are being raised. And so here's a really helpful table that I just put it here when we're thinking about sort of equity and justice in local adaptation. This is a table that a good friend and colleague of mine, Linda Shee out at Cornell, did a nice sort of synopsis of. So I spent the past 15 minutes or so talking about why cities are a good place to think about adaptation, planning, and implementation. Linda sort of came in and said, well, hang on. There are a lot of different constraints to this story that have to do with jurisdiction, that have to do with leadership, that have to do with kind of fiscal dependence across different issues, political cycles, the bounded geographies of particular jurisdictions, the lack of coordination, the lack of standardization of different practices. And so just to give you a sense of sort of the pros and cons of this story, I'm an urban planner. I certainly don't sort of constantly say that cities are the best place for doing this. There are barriers as well. And so thinking about equity and justice, oftentimes we're trying to sort of balance what are the strengths of doing things at the local level, but also trying to manage some of the disadvantages that Linda here has outlined in this table. All right, so moving into the second part of this presentation, really thinking about equity and justice. And so I just have a couple slides here just to orient some of the more definitions, sort of the foundations of why thinking about equity and justice is important for thinking about a local level adaptation beyond the institutions and governance questions, which are really important themselves. Here, I'm just raising an example here. Adaptation oftentimes is thought about, especially at the local jurisdictional level, in the context of economic development. Is how do we secure the kinds of infrastructures and assets so that they retain economic value? How do we support labor, productivity, investments, and secure the kinds of supply chains that are out there so that cities maintain the kinds of levels of development in the context of any kind of future climate impacts. And so this in itself, this framing is somewhat contentious. And so that's an immediate thing to pick up on is questions like, do we actually want to retain the kinds of economic pathways that we have currently driving cities in the context of ecological change 50, 100 years down the line? And also many people have picked up on the fact that, well, the development pathways that many cities have chosen to take over the past couple decades had disproportionate benefits to certain classes and groups. And so is that a trend, the inequality trend? Do we want to continue that going forward? And so just remembering back to the couple slides from New York City and from Laura from Miami, just to give you a sense of the imagery of the interventions that were being put in place. And this is one international example from Lagos in Nigeria, just to drive home that message of adaptation and climate resilient futures looks a certain way. It's very modern. It's about businesses. It's about investment in a certain kind of property. It's about creating a certain kind of livelihood and well-being that's green and sustainable and of a certain class of people. And in fact, this imagery looks very similar from the lower Manhattan, the Miami to the Nigerian example here. And so that brings up a certain kind of direction of where we ought to go for, where we ought to be. And one can argue that this vision of resilient cities is may not account for the interests and values of a lot of communities that live and work in this space and could not, I mean, just to drive home the point, could not pay for some of this living lifestyles that we're showcasing. The other way of thinking about equity and justice is from sort of a procedure standpoint. And so the previous slide was thinking about kind of distribution of wealth, distribution of well-being, distribution of living space and all that. This slide is really about procedures. It's about, okay, so I made a case earlier on about adaptation being embedded into regulations, legislations, and governance arrangements. And so there's a question around who's actually being represented, who's actually participating in some of the new policies and legislations that are being put forth, who's being targeted for financial or different social incentives, who gets a voice in designing those, who gets the voice in deciding who gets certain benefits and who loses out, who's actually aware of the different things that are happening out there. And many of you know, when we're talking about processes and decision-making and how people participate in public affairs around them, there's a lot of different things that come into play, different political dimensions of people's understanding of what's happening, people's value systems, and people just having different ideas about what ought to be or what should be, and having this conversation and having people who are more powerful in when they're participating in this conversation. And so when we're coming down to it, equity and justice in climate adaptation is really about a couple things, just high level. And then we're gonna dive into the specific sort of metrics and accounting. But here we have one of the first things what we need to do when we're trying to come up with indicators and metrics for equity and adaptation is coming up with some sort of definition of what we think we should be going for. Clearly, there are really broad parameters here, and people disagree about some of these terms that you're seeing here. People obviously make the good point that when you're scaling down these really general definitions, local context, local politics, and community interests come into play. And so things might be different in terms of definitions at the local level. Nonetheless, I think the argument that I'm trying to make here is that given the processes, given the decision chain that we saw from scientific data to institution building to regulations to implementations, so we see sort of opportunities for different sorts of capture by powerful people, capture by financial interests. It doesn't have to be financial, it could be different kinds of social interests as well. There are a lot of opportunities for that sort of perfect conceptual decision chain to be taken off course. And so then it leads to questions of winners and losers, of who gets to direct that chain. And also acknowledging, just going back to the table that my colleague Linda Shi has put together, cities are great, local governments are a great place to think about some of these things, but they're also constrained. And so there are spatial, scalar constraints in what cities can or cannot do. Taking those two together, the argument that I'm trying to make is that having a solid definition of some sort, negotiated definition that will change through time, is probably needed so that we make sure that what we want to do is actually feasible and possible given the different jurisdictional constraints of local governments, but also moves us in a direction where we make sure that the winners are much larger than the losers and group than the losers, and whoever is actually being displaced or being moved, for example, is adequately compensated. And in fact, that the participatory processes that we built in recognize the kinds of historic disadvantages that our communities and societies have built into it for many generations. And so the three things to keep in mind is participation. Yes, diverse voices that are negotiating here. How do we come up with metrics to make sure that inclusion happens? Redistribution of goods, infrastructures, and services is interesting. We intrinsically know that the development pathways that we're going on are beneficial to only certain groups. And so how do we change that going forward? And then the historic disadvantage part of race, class, gender, disability, indigenous communities, all those. How do we recognize those interests in the processes and the outcomes that we're talking about? Very general. And so next step on the decision chain here is using just a little tangent here, using those definitions, the broad definitions that I came up with that I talked about in the previous slide. I've been trying to feed some of these, seed some of this thinking in more global discourse. And so this is a project that I did with the Global Commission on Adaptation, which is a sort of a UN, World Bank, Gates Foundation funded exercise. And we could talk about the actors themselves, but let's not dwell on that at this point. There was a whole conversation around thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, the upcoming UNFCCC kind of global stock, the Paris Agreement global stocktake that's supposed to happen in 2023, and the COP that's coming up in November. How do we sort of think about equity and justice and adaptation? What do we need to do differently? And so this is just a slide just to give you a sense of these broad directions that we're trying to push the conversation towards. It's going from incremental solutions to something a bit more transformative on the right-hand side. And so this is just another slide to maybe visually understand sort of these broad conceptual domains that we're talking about. All right, so let's talk about monitoring progress in equity and justice. So I've spent a lot of minutes talking about why equity and justice is needed, what are the different broad dimensions of equity and justice that we need to focus on. It's about procedure, it's about distribution, it's about recognizing things, it's about recognizing historic disadvantage, it's about fairness in the distribution of benefits, but also potential losses. It's about all those things. And so the question that I went into this particular project is, so what do these different conceptual dimensions of equity and justice look like on the ground? I'm certainly not telling you anything that's surprising. All the practitioners that I talk to have some awareness of all of these different dimensions of equity and justice. My question was, okay, conceptually, we have a good sense of what these things are. What does it actually look like when it is being written into plans? What do these normative priorities actually look like in very practical, actionable arenas? And so we went in and looked through a selection, certainly not exhaustive, a selection of plans that are out there, looking for clues and signs of how equity and justice is talked about. What are the different projects and actions that are tagged to those normative priorities? And the question we also asked was, how do cities and local governments know that they're actually making good on the commitments or the projects that they articulated? What are the sorts of ways that they make sure that they're fulfilling some of the more normative priorities out there that maybe sometimes lack the quantification ability? And so we started off really just on the first hand doing this was the first step, going through all the plans and trying to understand what are the actual options, adaptation options that local governments highlight in their plans. And this is just drawings on, this table draws on some work that we did a couple years ago, trying to categorize the different options that we see in climate adaptation plans out there. And so options are tangible implementation actions, strategies, tools that local jurisdictions have designed to deal with climate impacts. How do they use the science and how do they embed it into actual things that they're doing? And there's structural options, there's institutional options, there's social options out there to try to maybe embed adaptation priorities within. So we use this list as a way to sort of tag and to catalog the different kinds of actions that local governments are using. And then we developed a little bit more elaborate definition of what the priorities are. So this is equity, inclusion, justice, high level definition that you saw earlier, and then some things that we could identify in the texts themselves to try to relate what we're seeing in the plans to the broad criteria out there. So things like plans identify adaptation needs for low-income, vulnerable communities, focus on enhancement of economic opportunities, access to safe living environments, etc. Those are sort of an equitable approach, and we would find options in the previous slide that sort of fit under these criteria. And then there's a whole set of criteria on processes, so different kinds of outreach tools, inquiry-based methods, more co-creative arenas. Obviously, there's a spectrum here. We would find evidence of all of that and sort of tag those as is inclusion. And then the final category was more recognitional type things that we were able to see, particular goals and options that strive to rectify systemic and entrenched inequalities based on all different kinds of things like race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. And then also emerging for the past couple of years, plans that embed specific language around anti-racism, transformation of all different types, social economic empowerment. All those would be tagged as sort of recognitional justice. And so that was our first step in trying to connect these broad criteria that very conceptual to actual things that we were seeing in being reflected in the things that the plans were writing and talking about. So then we delve into a little bit more to try to gauge. And so this is another thing that we added to the process of trying to uncover what's happening in the plans is depth of engagement. It's some plans would mention it, but there would be no mention equity and justice, but there would be no option associated. And so we wanted a way to sort of qualitatively delineate the depth of engagement. And so here you see procedural equity issues kind of being broken out into sort of more one-directional outreach type things to really in-depth, co-creative, co-productive workshops. Distribution type things, recognizing unequal vulnerability all the way to kind of rectifying and unfair access to different things, and then recognitional things, also breaking that down into recognizing past injustice to all the way to recognizing future injustice of those who are unborn, for example. And so we comb through all the different plans that are out there, and that process is ongoing. So I apologize in advance for not being able to show too much result, but some early insights. And so I do want this to sort of frame some of the discussions that we're having. Early insights, lots of procedural stuff that's out there. This diverse voices, the different interests participating in decision-making arenas, making sure that historically disadvantaged communities are somewhat participating is the most common thing that's out there. However, most of the options that we saw were outreach type things. So different knowledge and awareness workshops, media blitzes of different kinds, public engagement campaigns you see here, and then fewer as you go into the more deep procedural engagements. There's the middle part where there's a lot of climate advisory stakeholder committees that are sort of key decision maker led things. And then even fewer that have community workshops and sort of sustained community workshops and planning meetings. There are a lot of these happening, but one could say at this point that focusing much more on the one directional type things, just getting the news out there and trying to get people to come to meetings rather than having really, really deep conversations around what their communities and cities ought to be. Not really a critique here, just really showing you the universe of things that are out there. On the distribution criteria, there's a lot of specific things, particularly around improving access to certain kinds of services, providing resources support for particular neighborhoods, for weatherization, for energy assistance, all that. There's a lot of things on economic opportunity, making sure that whatever climate, jobs, green economy technologies that are out there, make sure that youth, for example, or women or historically disadvantaged groups are participating in those new forms of economic development. And then there's some on neighborhood retrofitting, community empowerment, anti-displacement, for example, just in response to the displacement gentrification examples that I showed earlier on. So it runs the gamut, lots of kind of redistribution, providing access, making sure that we're dealing with socioeconomic vulnerability in a way that makes sense, making sure that the opportunities that that climate adaptation work brings forth is offering benefits to those communities. And then recognition is actually the criteria, is the group of actions that are least far along compared to the procedure and the distribution things that we talked about. Recognition being sort of the fact that climate change affects historically disadvantaged communities much more than others. And historically disadvantaged communities in many contexts are minority communities, BIPOC communities, et cetera. And so we do see some examples of citywide forums on racism to recognize historic injustice in the context of climate change, but also development in general. We see emerging examples of racial equity reconciliation working groups, for example, and then health equity is something that that's being talked about a lot as well. And just so some initial insights, the data collection and coding is ongoing, and so I'm eager to learn from all of the people who are here today to get a sense of where they're seeing their own places and places that they know, and whether they're seeing some of the evidence of projects and options that are being put in place to connect to the more conceptual definitions of equity and justice, and whether or not some of these projects sort of ring a bell and what's in common. One before I launch into this slide, we're coming into the final couple slides now. I was on just a little tangent again. I was on a panel with somebody who was researching the adaptation process in San Antonio, Texas for a couple days ago. And we're talking about the fact that San Antonio, on the surface of it, has a lot of equity and justice work going on. And if you were just looking at the documents, that they would probably, quote unquote, score pretty high in meeting some of the criteria that's out there. But we got to talking and she was like, yeah, I guess that's true from a plan, kind of physical material standpoint. But when you really look into it, when you talk to people who are working in San Antonio, they're like, well, I think they were just paying lip service to the criterias. And you really dig into it, you're actually seeing that those who are making the decisions talk about equity and justice, but when it comes down to it, what they're doing is not really reflecting that. And she went on to give some examples of how really good equity and justice options of projects and ways of talking about equity and justice, especially from an anti-racist kind of social empowerment perspective, got removed from certain documents by who knows who as the process went along. And so there's certainly much more nuance in this conversation, and hence I'm kind of coming through as not really telling you what criteria ought to be, but to give you a sense of what those criteria can be, and having a much more constructive conversation around how do we account for those. So the purpose here is just really to give you a sense of what's commonly out there, where can we start to get some movement around being a bit more specific around these different dimensions, and that's a project we have to continue on. And so, but the San Antonio example really gives a good sense of actually throwing a wrench into the story that I've been telling of well, actually plans are articulating some of this really well, but that in itself can be a contentious process. All right, so some early insights from some of this work. Thinking about climate adaptation at the local level, science, tools, and data is not an issue for many cities. It's out there. The question is, how do they use this information? Especially how do they use it in a way to assess vulnerability, use it to think about the maldistribution of climate exposure to climate impacts in a way that encapsulates the kinds of internal inequities, divisions that those local governments experience on a day-to-day basis. And one thing that's really interesting is that thinking about vulnerability, especially, and differences in exposure to different kinds of climate impacts, much of this science translation process is very descriptive. It's describing the trends, describing the characteristics, but it's the jump from describing to actually designing actions to tackle that. That is a jump that not all cities and local governments manage to make. A lot of cities recognize that climate change exacerbates historical injustice. At least rhetorically, it's out there, and actually can create new inequalities as well. But even in the subset of plans and cities that we looked at, there lacks consensus around what ought to be done in response to that historical injustice. They're sort of just stuck at just saying that this is putting it out there, that historical injustice is going to be exacerbated by climate change. The so what question is we're sort of at the precipice of that. And some cities manage to encapsulate and answer that better than others. Of the adaptation options and responses that we cataloged, there's variable progress. Variable progress in a couple dimensions. Progress in actually connecting the science to implementation, connecting to the implementation to particular criteria that we articulated earlier, but also connecting between and across themselves. And so there's sectors that are much farther along. Health comes to mind. There are sectors that are much less farther along. I think very few equity and justice. There were some on employment and jobs. You see some cities focus on transportation. I think I saw a couple of Caltrans representatives here, and some on transportation, very little on sort of industries and sort of private sector participation. And so there's variable progress. And then the last dimension of variable progress is the depth of engagement, going from really descriptive, just highlighting that inequity and injustice is an issue, to actually doing something about it. The depth of engagement is variable as well. And also clearly variable across cities in this country even. And so one of the things that's sort of a main takeaway is oftentimes local governments, possibly because institutionally, jurisdictionally, that's what they do best, equity and justice actions predominantly focus on process, designing representative decision-making arrangements, public engagement communication. There's some that are about redistributing inequalities, so job training, retrofits, doing different kinds of food, health access, all that. The point in that middle rung distributional issue is that there's no consensus around what counts. And so cities tend to just do whatever they do. Sometimes it's low-hanging fruit, which we'll come back to earlier, or things that are really obvious for the city. But there's no consensus around, okay, so if we look across different cities, what does this middle rung of equity actions look like? And then the final thing is even fewer focus on recognitional justice. The historic entrenched disadvantage part. Some cities are making headway in articulating that upfront, but very, very few examples of actions that try to rectify that. And so I think this might be the final slide. I think I'm going long here. And so takeaways, some positives, that there is movement, that the rhetoric around equity and justice, especially the need to address those in climate adaptation, is permeating through many of the plans that we're seeing. A lot of them in larger cities, the smaller cities we still have to get to. And so that's an area for further research. And cities are proactively thinking about how to incorporate equity and justice actions. Although even in the broad evaluative criteria that we just set, there's a lot of variation, and there's a lot of unevenness in how cities think about equity and justice, and not even kind of going into how do they evaluate outcomes. There's almost no ability to broadly assess across cities outcomes. And so the project that I just presented tries to move us to a conversation around developing common understanding, possibly even assessment frameworks around what equitable and just actions ought to include and what are we actually evaluating. I've raised some examples of things that ought to be included, procedures, processes, certain services that are being distributed, recognizing certain historical values and interests from disadvantaged communities, et cetera. All those are sort of values that we're trying to articulate in this framework. But specific things and specific options to evaluate against, we're still trying to work to that. And because there's no common benchmarking exercise, local governments tend to approach the low-hanging fruits, easier things that could kind of check off boxes of yeah, I'm doing equity and justice, at least at the procedural level. The bigger structural changes, the bigger structural things, either because there are institutional barriers that we talked about, cities can't do everything, or they're just too difficult, or that the process just doesn't account for that. And so so one of the next steps to really think about is, okay, so we have some idea of what the really kind of immediate things are to deal with vulnerability, to include people, et cetera. What are the more structural things? And we really don't have a way to really encapsulate what that means in practice. Me sitting at the university, conceptually, we can articulate what that ought to be, but practically very little ability to articulate what that looks like, and not even having a common assessment framework. All right, and so I think that's it. I think I made okay time. We have 10 minutes or so for questions, and I'm eager to hear from everybody, because I certainly in my presentation didn't present any kind of, I don't know, actionable items. I guess I did, but it's more supposed to be thought-provoking rather than presenting research findings. Yeah.
So if anybody wants to share any of their thoughts on this, please do so in the chat box. But we did have a couple questions come in, if you don't mind me asking them for you, Eric.
Yeah.
One of the questions is, when looking at winners and losers, who makes the decision on sufficient compensation?
Good question, Adrian. Oh, Adrian. Oh, hi, Adrian. Who makes the decisions? That's a good point. No consensus on that point. There are sort of, and the form answer is if there's material loss of any sort, that could be somewhat objective, then that's a potential loser. But it's the winner and losers is sort of a way to just illustrate that there are benefits and there might be trade-offs. And in fact, if you really dig into it, it's a bit more complex than that. But that's a good question. But no, I don't have an answer to that, the who question. Yeah.
And then yet another question, have you looked at cities that have made good progress in this? And are there any that stand out, like Copenhagen?
Yeah, interestingly, in the work that I did for the Global Commission on Adaptation, Copenhagen was one of the examples that came through as being somewhat at the forefront of some of this. No less that, but because the Danish government made a good case to incorporate that. So we could have a conversation about that. But so this project itself is much more US based, but yes, there are other places, Copenhagen being one of them, has some good examples. out there on balancing health, sustainability, and growth, for example. I think the US, we're sort of going along here, but we're certainly not to the extent that Copenhagen is thinking about these things. Yeah.
Great. Another one from Caitlin.
Yeah.
Are there any off-the-shelf indicator sets that are better than others? For example, do you like the STAR community system?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great, Caitlin, that's a great question. Because indicators is not a new thing. There's a lot of M&E happening around the world, different indicators for buildings, for transportation, for green space, etc. I mean, you list it. People have tried to come up with indicators, especially in the context of sustainability indicators, for many, many years. So I'm not saying that they don't exist. It's just that when you get to the point where you're talking about really qualitative equity, justice, complex, uncertain issues, sometimes indicators either are missing or they're not quite capturing what we want to do. And so, yes, I mean, I can't list all the indicators right now. And so the exercise is really trying to distill indicators of indicators. And I did this for a different project that is not part of this, this presentation, but there are indicators out there that are very specific to particular sectors. And some of them are pretty good. Some of them are very technical and focus on replicability to the extent that it loses contextual meaning. But yes, those exist. And so what I'm talking about here is exercises to try to supplement some of those indicators that local communities are already using, that are about building performance, about usability, about cost benefits, et cetera, you name it. How do we add the equity and justice part into some of these indicators that are out there? Yeah.
Great, thank you. One of the questions we had in the chat, did you look at regulatory measures driving these plans, or were there any regulatory measures involved in all the cases?
Regulatory measures. Regulatory, I'm assuming, okay. Yes, a lot of the communities that we're looking at, the regulations are obvious. Sometimes it's a state mandate, like California, like New York. Sometimes it's a disaster management mandate, which many of our practitioner friends will know are very familiar with. Disaster Management Act 2000, I think.